I
Right.
wanted to talk about character for a second, and I'm
Sure.
coming at this question from a mom to two teenagers and having to explain the world around them and raise
Yeah.
two good kids. Is character still a criteria for leadership? And I asked this question, and I don't want to name names, but you look from, not just lawmakers, but church and local officials and military leaders, and it seems like we are putting people in position of authority and we are looking to their leadership, and they are deeply, deeply flawed individuals. Sometimes we don't know about it up front. Sometimes we do. We know full well the
Yeah.
person that we're putting in charge, and we're still putting them in charge. So is character still a criteria for leadership?
It's such a good question, Tori, and the answer is very affirmatively yes. There a few years ago, a man named Robert Wilson he asked a variety of historians to write chapters on presidents, recent presidents, going back to FDR. And he had people like Doris Kearns Goodwin and others who wrote, and the title of the book was "Character Above All." Character above all, and making the argument that that's the most important quality that a leader must have. Some people would disagree with that. Churchill felt that the most important attribute of a leader was courage, but they're very related. Courage often turns out to be something done with moral purpose, and so I think they are. I think they are related, and I do think that we ought to train our children to believe that, to have heroes, to have people they can look up to, or they can have role models. If you think about how many people you want to have your child, exposed to these days, or just in the last few years, it's a small number. It's people like John Lewis, or you can go through a list. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think people looked up to her, and John Lewis. They obviously looked up to. A lot of folks looked up to John McCain and how he suffered and was so brave about it getting through as a POW. American POWs in Vietnam, they've served the longest time in captivity of POWs in any war, and he came back a changed man. The people who often the people with the most character are the ones who've had the worst adversity in life somewhere along the way. There's been a crucible moment that has transformed them, or they've transformed themselves. Famously, from Franklin Roosevelt, who was sort of thought to be sort of light in his loafers, as a phrase goes. He wasn't taken very seriously. He was sort of a playboy in some ways. But when he had polio, and it totally disrupted his life, he tried for 7 years to learn how to walk again. He never could do it. But he transformed himself. He wasn't transformed by the polio. He transformed himself after the polio came. So you find often that people of character are people who developed it on their own. I would note one more point, if you could indulge me. Barbara Tuchman, who's was a wonderful historian, and her daughter was head of the Carnegie Endowment for a long time, Jessica Tuchman. Very fine family. Barbara Tuchman did a study of history, and to figure, and toward the end of it, she went through and examined historically each great societies along the way, like the going back to Greece and Rome and coming forward. She looked at 4 or 5 different societies, civilizations in effect, and asked the question. Each one of them tried to train young people for governance. And she pointed out that in almost every case they failed. And what her conclusion was, the one thing you really should work on in trying to develop a new generation is their character. And that's something that ought to be very central to the conversation and to the decision making. That at the end of the day, you want people who have character in your office. And we will never rebuild trust in our government and in many different sectors unless we restore trust. People, we have lied so many times and misled people so many times that it's really very difficult. And now with social media, it's even harder. I think it's harder to govern. It's harder to lead than you. In significant part because of social media, but that does not excuse the inexcusable. The number of people who have, I think, misled us and have created these vast chasms now It's much, much harder to deal with the problems you're focused on in the Concord Coalition. How do you get people to believe? They've got to believe there's a serious problem by piling up all these debts over time. And until they believe that and believe the people who are talking to them, they're not going to take serious action. It's like the no vax people. They just don't believe it, that it's a serious problem. They think government is trying to stick something down their throats, and they're not going along with it. I think it's harder to get the deficits under control today than it was when the Concord Coalition was first created back 30 years ago.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's I can certainly vouch for that. I think it's true.